we believe that a God who is ordered and rational created a universe that is rational and ordered. And mathematics is just one of the many ways that men and women in the sciences are discovering that every day.
Well, welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janelle Wood, and I'm here with Lizzy, who's been curating the content for this podcast over the last few weeks, actually the last couple of months, which has been pretty cool. It's been a little while. We actually have some more, is that the right word? Some more new episodes. I feel like that's the wrong adjective.
I think so is unnecessary. You can just say more new episodes.
We have more new, there we go. We have more, I only had 2.5 hours of sleep left.
So it's just redundant.
Yeah. We have more episodes that are coming your way, more new episodes, but I'm taking some time off in the month of July, enjoying some time with my family. Lizzy, you're taking some time off too, right? You get to enjoy some summer activities.
I have stuff here and there.
You have stuff here and there. So you and I are going to record a Patreon episode that's going to go out the end of June, and we'll also have one the end of July. And starting again in August, we're going to have some new content for you with Lizzy and I podcasting together. You don't want to miss that. We just had a really great recording with a couple people, and you definitely want to check those out. But for now, we're pulling old episodes out of the vault, things that have never seen the light of YouTube. I've been podcasting for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in September. And these are episodes I thought that maybe would be really cool for you, but also for whoever's listening, that you might find some value in this. So I hope that you enjoy this particular episode.
Yeah.
Okay. See you soon. Bye.
Welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janelle Wood. I am so glad you're listening in today. We almost forgot to press record. We, meaning I. We've been starting off each month this season 5, with a different young woman sharing her faith story and allowing her the space to ask some tough questions about God and Christianity. And this month, if you've been listening, we've been featuring conversations with or for Zoe from France. Zoe is an 18-year-old former exchange student, and we met last year when I was her exchange coordinator while she was in the U.S. She also lived with some of my favorite people in our town, and during her year here, became very good friends with our exchange student, Leonie from Germany. So Zoe's a special person in my life, and in that first episode that aired earlier this month, Zoe shared questions she has about Christian faith. And since then, we've had some fantastic conversations, including the episode that aired last week with Xandra Carroll. I loved the way that Xandra spoke to Zoe's questions. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend you go and check out all the episodes from this month and hear more of Zoe's faith journey. Check out those episodes at findingsomethingreal.com. We'll also link them in the show notes. I am very excited to say that Zoe was able to come back here today. And I know it's after 9 in France, and technology never ceases to amaze me. So Zoe, thank you for being here today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, it's always a privilege to record these with you. And this is our last one besides the Patreon episode that will air. I know you mentioned last week something that after these conversations, you usually spend a few days thinking about what we talked about. Did that happen after last week's conversation with Xandra? And if so, what stood out to you from that conversation?
Yes, it happened again. And well, basically everything that she said, she talked about a rainbow and how she sees the rainbow in a different way. Like she said that people said rainbow is just photons with lots of rain, but she sees that as the way of God putting new photons and drops of rain, creating the rainbow. And it just made me think of like everything that I see, I can see differently. And it was just really weird.
It messed with you all week.
Not all week, but a few days.
Well, Zoe, I'm thrilled that we will be talking today with someone that I really admire. In fact, I just watched one of the videos that I think was like 4 years ago where he was talking about some of the science behind reasons why he believes. And I just thought it was so compelling. But Dr. Andy Bannister is the director of Solas and an adjunct lecturer at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. Andy holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and is an adjunct research fellow at the Center for the Study of Islam and Other Faiths at Melbourne School of Theology. Andy is also the author of an academic book, an oral formulaic study of the Quran, and 2 popular level books, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, or The Terrible Consequences of Really Bad Arguments, and his latest, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? I also think he has another book coming out pretty soon, too. We'll talk about that. When not traveling, speaking, or writing, Andy is a keen hiker, mountain climber, and photographer. He is married to Astrid, and they have 2 children, Katrina and Christopher. He's also been a guest on one of my favorite podcasts, Unbelievable, with Justin Brierley. And I've loved listening to his perspective there as well. So happy to have you here, Andy. Thank you for being on the Finding Something Real podcast.
It's great to be with you, Janelle, and great to meet you, Zoe. So there we are, three countries on the podcast tonight. Very exciting.
I know, it's wonderful. Well, and it's nighttime where you're at because you're in the UK, but here it's 12 o'clock. Yeah. It's lunchtime. It's crazy. Andy, you also have your own podcast too, if I'm not mistaken, because I listened to some of that in preparation for this.
Now, that always gets tricky, Janelle, when people are vague like that, because there are 2 podcasts I'm involved in. So through Solas,
okay,
the organisation I'm part of here, we have Pep Talks. It might have been that one.
Okay,
so that's
that was
where myself,
one.
Yeah. So myself and Christy Mayer, who's a good friend of mine in London, brilliant kind of young philosopher. She and I, every 2 weeks, we get a guest on just to talk about some aspect of their Christian faith, how they communicate that with others, and it's fantastic. We've had everything from academics to artists to, bus drivers to, you name it, everybody. The warden is and his wife or her husband has come through that show. So yeah, we have a lot of fun with that. So no, I do. So there's that podcast.
Okay. But there's another one.
No, the other one, there's a little podcast on the side. So a couple of years ago during COVID, when everyone was bored, right, and looking for projects, a friend and I, who often would get on Zoom and spend hours, drinking whiskey together and the Scotch stuff, not what passes for whiskey in America, it must be said. Talking about sort of life, the universe, and theology, and God, and everything. We said to ourselves, we should start recording these things and seeing if we could do them as a podcast. And I think we genuinely thought like our families might listen, and that was it. So we thought we might get 12 or 13 listeners, but we ended up with over 1,000. So he and I do a show called Pod of the Gaps. And that's every 2 weeks. So we take a big contemporary issue, something perhaps contentious in the media, and we try and explore it in a thoughtful way from a Christian perspective, because there's a lot of shouting at each other on the internet, and we wanted to go, how can we create a space where we can talk about, whether it's science or sexuality or sports, here we are, World Cup season, or media or whatever it is, ecology. How can we think about these things? Because I love that comment that you made, Zoe, that Zandra had made you kind of think about the fact that Christianity potentially kind of sheds light on everything. You can't, if it's true, you can't see things that you've taken for granted the same way. And so that podcast unpacks some of that with some terrible humor. Because I must say, I do like a dad joke.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes so that people can find you, your ministry, and the podcast. But for those of you, people who are listening who have not heard of Solas, would you share a little bit more about what that is and what your ministry is all about? Yeah,
that's very kind of you, Janelle, to ask. So Solas is the Gaelic word, the Scots word that means light. And so Solas was a ministry started in Scotland about 12 years ago. I've been with it for about half that time. And so we really do a couple of things at Solas. The first thing we like to do is take the message of Jesus and try and take it outside the four walls of the churches and into places where people who wouldn't have any faith would be more relaxed to go. So we help churches put on events in, coffee shops, restaurants, cafes, pubs. I know that's not such a big thing in the States, but here pub culture is a big thing. We do events on universities and in workplaces, really helping people think about the big questions of life in a way that's sort of engaging and winsome, and trying to show that perhaps Christian faith makes good sense of some of these big questions. And then the other half, what we do is teaching and training and equipping Christians to be able to talk about their faith in a thoughtful way, an engaging way with their friends, neighbors, colleagues, classmates, and so forth. And then we do both those things as well online. So we've got a big website with lots of digital media content there. One of the things we're famous for, we've got this series now running for a few years now called Short Answers, where we take a tough question about the Christian faith and we try and give a 5-minute answer to it, which is not always easy because a lot of big questions deserve more than 5 minutes. But we think for even the biggest question, you can probably at least scratch the surface in 5 minutes and get people perhaps thinking a bit. So that's the kind of thing we do.
Andy, how did you personally come to faith? Has Christianity always been part of your story?
In a sense, yes, it has. And so I was raised in a Baptist kind of family in London, England, where I grew up. I mean, I always like to say you don't have to be a Baptist to go to heaven, but why take chances? That's my no. So I grew up. See what I mean? Dad jokes, right? Terrible. I could see Zoe going, "What? No, make it stop. It's hardly started, but make it stop." And no, so raised a Baptist home, and then I think like a lot of kids from that kind of background, faith for most of my beginning of my life was what my parents did. So I did it, but I did it because they did it. And it wasn't until I was about 13 or 14 that I think a little light bulb moment came when I thought, hang on, if this is true, then I need to respond to it for myself. It's not enough to kind of sort of, have my parents follow Jesus and me tag on their coattails. I need to say yes myself. And so I was at a youth camp, a youth weekend away, aged about 13 or 14. It was literally a dark and stormy night, and the tent was shaking, and the youth leader was preaching his heart out, and something connected. And so I sort of, went forward in the meeting and kind of raised my hand, as it were, and said, I want to follow Jesus for myself, and haven't looked back. Although what is interesting looking back, questions have always been part of my faith, because very early on, after that moment, I began then, asking questions. I'd ask my leaders and stuff, well, hang on, about this, what about this? And I've always been someone who philosophy and big questions of life intrigue me and stuff. So in a sense, what I do now is just an extension of what I was doing then, just the questions are perhaps bigger as you get older.
Did you always know that you wanted your occupation to be linked to ministry?
No, not at all. In fact, for my first few years of life, first 6 years of my working life, I worked for a local hospital and doing conference management. So I helped them put on medical conferences and the such like. And that was huge fun. And interestingly, at that time, I was still figuring my faith out, because I was very much a private Christian at that point. I don't think I ever really let on at work I was a Christian. I hid my faith away. I kind of I was basically an undercover Christian. But I've long thought undercover Christian would make a great movie title. Christians sneaking around at work, trying not to get outed. But then after 6 years of doing that, I had the first opportunity to go into full-time kind of ministry. I was doing a little bit of youth kind of stuff at church on the side, but I had this amazing opportunity to, particularly given that I hadn't really got the experience for the job, but there was a group of parents who'd been praying for some of the local schools in the part of London next to mine, and they raised enough money to hire a youth worker to come and try and be a bridge between the churches and the schools. So my job was to go into the schools as often as I could, find any way I could to get into schools and build bridges there with the young people. So I did everything from, helping kids who couldn't read, to helping with sport, to, teaching religious studies classes when there were open opportunities, helping the Christian campus groups, anything and everything. And it was huge fun because you learn to communicate very quickly. Here in the UK, we have, I don't know how it's in the States or in France, but we have, most schools here have assemblies where the whole school is gathered together. Usually there's a sort of little sort of thought for the day type thing. So I would often get to go and give those. And so I learned very quickly that when you're basically with 1,000 young people aged 11 to 18 on a Monday morning, you've got 5 minutes to talk to them. They don't really want to listen to you. And if you get too direct in what you talk about, the headmaster won't ask you back. You learn very quickly. And so I got a crash course in speaking fast and succinctly. So I love that. So that was when I first stepped into this line of work. And then really what pushed me into this line of work was that book you mentioned, the Muslim book, was in my mid-20s, encountering Muslims in London, discovering they believe very different things to what I believed. They asked some very darn good questions, actually. Really challenged me to think through what I believe, really challenged me to look quite deeply into, well, okay, is Christianity true? Because it's not the only option. There are other options out there. And that eventually, asking those questions, went all the way to a PhD, which was fascinating. I just sort of, the rabbit hole didn't stop for a while.
Well, you mentioned being an undercover Christian, and it sounds like that didn't last very long. You're in the UK, as we mentioned. Zoe's in France. I'm here in the western part of the United States. And while the majority of listeners to this podcast may be from the US, we definitely have different cultures represented in the audience as well. So I feel like this is an important question. What is the cultural climate, so to speak, regarding faith where you're at, Andy? What is it like to be? Are there a lot of undercover Christians, do you find?
Yes. And in fact, interestingly, just today, there were headlines made in the UK, a lot of the major newspapers running with a story that the last national census data has just come out in the last few days. And one thing that's come out of it is that Christians are a minority now in the UK. Less than 50% of people in the UK identify as Christian. I think it's 48.6% or something like that. That sounds about right. Obviously 19% of statistics are made up on the spot. That's see, another dad joke. But there's been a lot of hoo-ha about that. But it was interesting. I found looking at that is quite interesting because the UK has always been quite a secular country all the time that I remember. Yes, and it's probably the same in the US. I would imagine less in France for Zoe's context. But here, I think there's been a lot of people who've always just would say, well, I'm Christian because I'm white British, and so therefore that's Christian is a cipher for that's my culture. And I think one of the things is interesting actually, and why I look at that figure today and I don't get particularly worried. I think one of the things that has happened of late, especially I think COVID has accelerated this actually. A lot of people who are just, nominally Christian, that's kind of burns away. We lost a lot of those during COVID, people who perhaps just showed up on a Sunday because of what they'd always done, then never reappeared again after the pandemic. But how deep that faith was originally, I don't know. Now in the UK, what's interesting is if you go to a church and grab a random churchgoer, you are probably very likely to get a person who, he or she is going to believe in God pretty seriously, because there are lots of other options out there. And then the other thing I would add about the UK right now is I think spiritually it's very open, which is interesting. I was intrigued, Zoe, that rainbow story that you told. I would say I do a lot of stuff on university campuses, and I think lots of people are asking questions about things like beauty, ecology, meaning, purpose, identity, suffering, all those kind of things. And if you can talk about those and open up conversations about that, people are very interested. I think if you come after some of the more traditional things, if I did an event on the campus and advertised a debate on does God exist, you might not get many people. Advertise an event saying, why is there suffering? Or, do human rights exist? Or, how do we save the planet? ? Or something. You'll get hundreds of people. So I think we live in this very interesting times right now. And I think for you guys in the US, it occurs to me as a US watcher from over here, I think you're following that path. I think the US, is secularizing. And I think many Christians find that frightening. I don't think it has to be frightening. Actually, I just think we need to adapt. Jesus doesn't change, but the culture and the people asking the questions change.
Yeah. The talk that I was listening to that you gave, I think it was 4 years ago, you were talking at the beginning of your conversation, you shared about how Christianity is growing in Africa, in China, and different countries. It's moving south and east, and in the West, it's changed so much. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that Christianity is declining, that it's no longer popular to say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian?
Well, I think a number of things are going on. In fact, so many things are going on. It's hard in some ways to unpack all of that, but just a few observations. I think the first thing I would say is, of course, I'm not actually sure it is declining in the West. I think I once would have, referenced that. Now I think it's much more complicated, actually, because one of the things that's complicated is immigration. Because one of the other stories out of today is that in two of our major cities in the UK, that, British people are a minority. In London, there are more people who are born outside the UK living there than there are people born in the UK. London is incredibly diverse. Well, you look into that and you go, well, that's fascinating, because a lot of our biggest churches in London would be immigrant churches. Some of the Black Pentecostal churches are massive. The Iranians, I know that context because of my stuff with Muslims. The Iranians are the fastest growing church in the world in terms of the number of people putting faith in Jesus. So you've got all those patterns going on, and also then people coming into the UK. And I think this is probably the same for the US too, because you have a lot of certainly coming across the border from the south, with a lot of Hispanics coming into the country. Now, they're often quite conservative and quite religious, and we're seeing the same here. That actually, although it's perhaps the indigenous British population is sort of a bit cynical and secular, a lot of the communities that are coming in and are making the UK home are far more serious in their faith, and that's fantastic. I remember the other month or so meeting a street evangelist on the streets of London. He was an African guy who'd come here to, win the UK for Christ. I was like, this is fantastic, because 200 years ago, we were sending missionaries to their country, and now they're sending missionaries to us. And it's like, I love it. That is just phenomenal. So I think it's exciting what's going on. And as you say, on the world scene, it's unbelievable. I mean, China is about to be the most populous Christian country. I mean, who saw that one coming? Africa had 9 million Christians in it, I think, about 1900, I think is the figure. It's going to hit 600 million this century. I mean, those are astonishing figures. Wow. So we forget. It's very easy to assume that the church is Europe or the church is the USA. But one of my, there was a wonderful, he died a couple of years ago, a wonderful African theologian called Lamin Sana, who I love his writings. And Lamin wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called Whose Religion is Christianity? And he makes the point, he said, Christianity is the only world faith tradition that has shifted geographically in the way it has. So Islam begins in Arabia. It remains centered on Arabia. Muslims today pray in Arabic, facing Mecca in Arabia. So it's still an Arabian faith. Thailand is still the world center of Buddhism. Over 90% of the world's Buddhists are found in Thailand or that part of Asia. Christianity, so on the other hand, it begins in the Middle East. It grows out of the Middle East and becomes very quickly an African faith. All those early church, fathers, Augustine and all those guys, they were all North Africans. So it's a very African faith. Then it comes into Europe, and we've got, Spain, France, across into the UK, becomes a European faith. Then with the Pilgrim Fathers, it hops across the Atlantic and becomes an American faith. Then it goes south and becomes a Southern American faith. Now it's migrated into China and is largely a Chinese and African faith in terms of the center of where the numbers are. And Lamin says, you can't pin it down. Isn't it amazing? Because Christianity transcends culture. You can't pin God down to a culture, and it's beautiful. And his answer, the book is called Whose Religion is Christianity? And his answer is everyone's and no one's. It's everyone because Jesus is for anybody, but it's nobody's because nobody has the right to go, it's ours, because you can't get away with that.
Wow. I got chills when you were sharing that, because I was thinking of how Jesus at the end, when he was about to return to heaven, just says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. It's just beautiful to actually see that happen. I want to give Zoe a chance here to ask some questions.
Zoe's been sitting so patiently. So
it's been awesome. Any thoughts or comments on what Andy shared so far, or any questions you want to ask him, because he knows a lot of things.
Don't big it up too much. I don't know everything, but I can. If you do ask a question I don't know, I usually know a woman or a man who does know the answer. So.
I had a question. You talked before about Muslims. So you talked with Muslim people. Did that change the way you saw God in Christianity? Like, did that make your relation stronger, or did that make your relation with God differently after having a different point of view?
Oh, well, yeah. What a great question, Zoe. Thank you for that. So I would say two things happened, Zoe. Firstly, when I first began talking with Muslims in London, it quite shook my faith, actually, because the Muslims I met were very confident. They had questions I never encountered before. A lot of them had actually been trained how to engage with Christians and how to ask difficult questions, because a lot of mosques do that, because Muslims are passionate about their faith. They're a missionary faith as well. So I remember that initially quite shook me, but I'm always a great believer in, if you come across a question you can't answer, you don't assume the other person is right. You go and dig around a bit, first of all. It could be they are right, or it could just be you haven't found the answer. Yeah. And so I did quite a bit of reading. I talked to men and women I knew Islam infinitely better than I did. I had a few, even at that point, one or two friends who were former Muslims. And so I read widely, which initially then helped me get answers to some of the questions, which meant I could then hang in the conversations a bit better. But then as I dug deeper, as I went into the PhD years, Zoe, then what I found out is, that sort of second half of your question, I think it actually deepened my faith in God, because I guess I went into things assuming that, look, Muslims and Christians worship the same God. They both believe in one God, must be the same God, right? That was my default position. But as I learned Arabic, as I studied the Quran deeply, as I began really exploring that question of what is God like, I suddenly realized actually, both the Quran and the Bible assume that God exists. Neither of them set out to argue for his evidence why God exists. They assume God exists. But what they're both interested in is, what is God like? And when you study that question, you realize this is profoundly different visions. And I think, having been brought up on the Bible, I took things for granted. I took it for granted that God is relational. The God of the Bible is a God who walks and talks with his people. He's a God who steps into history in the person of Jesus. I assume that was the default. Well, it isn't, because the God of the Quran doesn't do that. The God of the Bible is a God who makes himself known, who invites us to know not just about him, but to know him. And again, I assume that was standard. It's not. The Quran doesn't do that. And then lastly, the interesting one is love. I think I assumed, well, every faith tradition teaches that God is love. Well, actually, it doesn't, because the Quran doesn't really use those categories. You don't get to call God your father in the Quran. God in the Quran didn't step into history and give his life for you to demonstrate how much he loves you. And nowhere does the Quran say that God is love. It says lots of things about God, but not that. The Bible does do all those things. So actually, I guess I would say I fell in love more with the God of the Bible the more I looked at Islam. But I just want to clarify, though, that doesn't mean I'm very careful, because I love my Muslim friends. I respect them. I have valued the engagement with them over the years. So just because I don't believe the Quran is true doesn't mean I have negative views of Islam or anything like it. In fact, quite the opposite. My hope and prayer is that Muslims I know, I can help them see Jesus for who he is. And I've had the privilege over the years of seeing Muslim friends who've come to faith in Christ. And it's fantastic. It's just wonderful. I had a dear friend for some years, who's dead now, but a friend of mine called Nabil Qureshi, who was a Pakistani Muslim and became a Christian and wrote an amazing book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. It's just such a wonderful story, because Nabil was a passionate Muslim, and he wanted to know God better. And as he tried to know God better, he discovered to his utter surprise that the God he was pursuing was Jesus. And it's just such a lovely story. And if you get a chance to read it, that was a New York Times bestseller, his testimony. Yeah. So I hope that helps a little bit. That was a long answer to a brilliant question. Thank you for that.
You got some more brilliant questions over there, Zoe.
No. I also have Muslim friends, so we sometimes talk about that, and it's just, for me, there's like so much interesting thing in like all the religions, and I don't know. I just wanted his opinion. But
yeah, well, one thing I would say straight away, by the way, is I think the fact that there's so many religions, as you observe. I mean, I think that in itself is interesting, right? Because I find it fascinating that wherever you look in space and time and history, human beings have always been profoundly religious, and I think that's a clue. I'm a great believer that there's lots of clues. I like that language throughout the universe. You mentioned beauty, and that's a big one for me. I'm a mountain climber. For those of you, I don't know if they're doing the video of this podcast, but behind me is this mountain picture. That's the English the highest point in England on the wall behind me there. And to go, why do we find beauty appealing? Why do we climb mountains? But why are we spiritual? And it's interesting to say, wherever you look around the world and through history, men and women have always been religious. And even today, even in secular societies, you could even argue that actually when the traditional gods get chased out the front door, other things come through the back door. So, I have friends who are atheists, but they read their horoscope, or they meditate, or, some of the sort of, some of the political movements in our culture become almost like religions. I'm a passionate environmentalist, but parts of the environmental movement have become almost like a religion for some people, because we can't avoid the fact we're deeply religious. So I found that fascinating. So tell me about this beauty. Tell me about the rainbow, though. I found that interesting, Zoe. I'm going to turn this around because you said that you hadn't got any questions for a moment. So that sounds fascinating. What was it that Sandra said that made you start looking at nature in different ways?
Well, she just made a comparison. Is that how you say it? Yeah.
A comparison, yeah.
Yeah. Between how, like, some people would just say that rainbow is like just a reaction between two things, but she saw that more as it's a reaction between two things that God created, and that makes that even more beautiful, that he was able to create such a beautiful thing. And it just made me think that, so everything that I can see around me, I can see differently, not just it's something in the nature, it's actually something that was created, and it was created that way, and that's why it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's something really helpful she shared with you there, because I think one of the things that I've found fascinating over the years, right, is going, I think if we live in a godless universe, it's always helpful to the contrast, right? Going, okay, if all that exists are atoms and particles and molecules, or if God in some form exists, beauty is one of those things that doesn't really fit very well into a materialistic universe, because if we just live in that world of atoms and particles, then the only story to explain us is evolution. The evolution is selected for us for fitness. Your job as a biological entity is to reproduce and pass your DNA on to the next generation, and then your job is done. Well, where does appreciating rainbows fit into that? Unless that helps you reproduce in some way, maybe you kind of meet a member of the opposite sex talking about rainbows or something. But other than that, it's pointless. Or mountains. I remember once talking to an atheist friend about this who looked a bit puzzled. And he went, "Oh yeah, it's a challenge." And he sat and thought about it for a moment. He went, "Oh well, maybe our love of natural beauty comes because tens of thousands of years ago, our ancient ancestors knew that a beautiful natural landscape with grasslands and a river running through it was a good place to hunt game, and so that's where the love of beauty came from." And I looked at him and I went, "Dude, I just come back from trekking in the Himalayas. I went to the North Face base camp of Everest, where it's just ice and glaciers and rock. Trust me, I don't think even the most mental caveman would have thought the North Face of Everest is a good place to go hunting bison." So yeah, I think whether it's rainbows or mountains or a beautiful piece of music or a piece of art, whatever it is that you appreciate, and gosh, you're in France, what a culture! Your culture is full of amazing works of art of all descriptions. I think it's a great big clue, personally, that something much bigger is going on.
Andy, one of the apologetics that I heard you talking about in a video that I watched was math. You talked about math, and I've never heard anyone talk about that. Would you briefly share that? Because I found that so compelling. Yeah.
Well, it's biblical, right? You've got the book of Numbers. Sorry, another dad joke. Yeah, I love the transatlantic difference here, because of course for you it's maths. For us, it's maths. And what is it in France, Zoe? Is it plural when you talk about mathematics in French, or is it singular?
It's plural.
Right, there we go. Europeans are united. Love it. So maths is I stumbled across that a few years ago. So it's not original to me. I forget who I first read on this. I read a book by a couple of mathematicians who just made an interesting point that really got me excited, because I'm someone who I do love, as well as the arts, I love the sciences as well. There was a lot of sort of sciencey computing stuff involved in my PhD, which I won't bore you with. But maths, right? So maths is interesting because, maths is all about numbers. Well, here's the question. What exactly is a number? There's a nice deep philosophical question for you. It's the afternoon for you. For Zoe and I, it's like the evening. So, we're half asleep. But what is a number? What is the number 2 or the number 7 or, any number you care to pick? Well, of course, if we live in a purely materialistic universe, a universe with no God behind it, okay, numbers are basically something that Mesopotamian goat herders invented sometime around about 2,500 BC, was we think when number systems were invented, probably to keep track of their goats. So people started scratching marks on rocks and bits of clay to keep track of things. So numbers are a purely human invention, initially invented to keep track of basic things like that. Okay, if that's what a number is, how on earth is it that numbers plug into the laws of physics? How is it that numbers can be used to describe the curvature of space-time, the interior geometry of black holes? What is going on? Either those Mesopotamian goat herders got very lucky, or something much bigger is going on. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a mathematics prof in Oxford, and he sort of reinforced that discovery, that observation I'd come across. He went, absolutely. He said, when we mathematicians do mathematics, he said, we are not creating, we are discovering. In maths, doing mathematics is like exploring another country. Nobody invented Mount Everest. We discovered it. The Europeans discovered it in 1850, whatever. The same when we do mathematics, we're discovering this realm of mathematics. So that raises the stonkingly big question: where is that realm located? We're not talking about physical things, not talking about atoms and particles, things like numbers and mathematical constructs. Well, they exist in minds, don't they? That's where those things live. They live in minds. So that would rather be a bit of a clue to the idea that, well, if these things then plug into the laws of physics that power the very universe, surely perhaps the best explanation is behind the universe is a mind of some kind, because otherwise, what on earth is going on? And in fact, there was a very famous paper, scientific paper, written by an atheist mathematician in the 1950s, I think, called Eugene Wigner, who was Hungarian. So another score one for the Europeans this evening. And he wrote a paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Physical Sciences. And that was the paper that first put that idea out there. And he uses the word miracle. He says it's a miracle. It's literally a miracle that these numbers that we play around with actually work in the real world. We can't explain it. We just need to be profoundly grateful that they do, but it's a total mystery. But it's not if you're a Christian, of course, because you can go, well, we believe that a God who is ordered and rational created the universe is rational and ordered. And mathematics is just one of the many ways that men and women in the sciences are discovering that every day.
Zoe, I was watching your face during all of that, and a couple of times you looked astonished. What was going through your mind when he explained that?
Well, I never saw math that way. Maybe I would have liked it better. Told me that before.
I love it.
But it's wow. No, it's really interesting. Yeah. I've really never thought about that in that way. For me, it was just number, and it was just it was something different than physics, but I never saw it it fit with physical like theory and stuff like that.
Well, I'm with you on not really enjoying. I struggled my way through maths when I was younger. Well, let me blow your mind some more then, actually, just for some fun then. If you're not someone who's naturally into mathematics, Zoe, there's the other weird connection is mathematics and beauty. So we've talked a bit about beauty this evening because you gave that beautiful illustration of the rainbow. Well, some very curious ways that maths and beauty aligns. For example, there's a thing called the Fibonacci sequence, which is a sequence of numbers discovered by an Italian mathematician called something Fibonacci, and don't ask me to get that. I'll get the dates totally wrong. Just people listening can Google it. And the Fibonacci sequence is a series of numbers where each number is the sum of the numbers before it. So it goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 11, and so on. Each number in the sequence is the sum of the two numbers before it. Now, why is that interesting? Is that just a random series of numbers? Well, that number turns up all over nature. That describes he first discovered it it turns out in the way that rabbit populations grow. Rabbits breed very fast, but the Fibonacci sequence totally describes the way that rabbit populations grow. You can draw a curve, you can plot a curve using the spiral using those numbers. That spiral turns up in the leaves of plants, it turns up in the curve of shells, turns up all over the place. And there seems to be something particularly attractive. It turns up all over art So the Mona Lisa, which is hanging on the wall of the Louvre in Paris, in your wonderful country, somebody's observed that actually the Fibonacci spiral actually can be mapped onto the face of Mona Lisa. And there's something very pleasing and very beautiful about that spiral when it turns up in nature. We don't know why. We can't figure out why. Symmetry is very important in nature. If you ask people to rank faces, or whether it's photographs or paintings of people by how attractive they find them, the more symmetrical, mathematically symmetrical the face, the more attractive we find it. And then, of course, all over architecture and so on. So there's a very strong link between maths and beauty as well. And in fact, if you want to put this in your show notes, Janelle, there is a wonderful book written by two American mathematicians. So the score one for the Americans, called Mathematics Through the Eyes of Faith. I forget the authors off the top of my head, but if you Google Mathematics Through the Eyes of Faith, you will find the authors for that. It is available from wherever good books are sold, or if you're totally desperate, you can use Amazon.
All right. I want to pivot this conversation just a tad, because I've had a number of young women, especially from Europe, on this podcast, girls that I love. And one of the things that I hear sometimes is, it's just not relevant to my culture. Like, no one that I know is talking about this. No one's talking about God. Zoe, you're shaking your head. Do you agree with me?
Yeah.
You've never had a conversation before you came here about God with your peers. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I've never really had that.
Yeah. So, Andy, would you speak to the relevance of Christianity? We talked a little bit about Christianity, that it hasn't really died down. It's growing in different parts of the world. In the Western part of the world, it's been taken over by, I would say, secularism, maybe humanism, I don't know. But how is Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that's what the Bible says, how is that relevant to someone like Zoe? And how does it change your life believing in him?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say, Zoe, I totally appreciate it can be hard if you're the only one kind of thinking about some of these things. Although I would not be totally surprised if perhaps you have sort of friends around you who, though they may not have admitted it, actually do occasionally lie awake at night thinking about some of the bigger questions of life. They may not have attached it to the God piece, but I think I've come across that with friends, particularly when tragedy strikes. Actually, sometimes it takes when something goes wrong in life, when suffering happens. That is often a wake-up call for people to start asking. Or I had a friend when they lost ther job. That was the clinch moment to going, gosh, everything I've been living for is this, and this thing has now gone. Now what? But on the general relevance question, Janelle, what I would say is that I think I love the way that you mentioned that Christianity has in some ways been, supplanted by humanism. What I think humanism has done, and it's a little conjuring, just a little trick that hasn't been noticed, is as humanism came in, took all of the kind of fruit and products, as it were, of Christianity that only actually work if God exists, threw God out, and they're sort of hoping nobody will notice. The classic example I would give of that, and I use this example when I speak on university campuses all the time, is human rights. Because take any human rights abuse you care to mention. This week, I don't know what it's been like in America and in France, what's been in your headlines, but over here, two stories that I found quite interesting because they've occurred in the same week, has been all of those riots in the Apple factories making the iPhones out there in China, with Chinese, effectively Chinese slave labor in those factories. And it's this dirty little secret that there's Apple, the company we all love because it makes these amazing products. Actually, you lift the surface and to go, there are some quite dodgy employment practices. And finally, a lot of those Chinese workers have gone, forget it, we've enough of being treated like rats in a cage. So it's outrageous. That's been one of the news. And then also Qatar with the World Cup. And, obviously the more obvious thing that's being talked about is LGBT rights in Qatar. But I've also said to people, I'm a bit distressed that actually there isn't enough talk given about women's rights in Qatar or against slave labor. A lot of those stadiums were built by immigrant labor treated like slaves in the Middle East. It's horrendous the way that Qatar has behaved. So two big human rights abuses have gone on and been in the news. Okay, what is actually wrong with abusing somebody's human rights? What is wrong with oppressing somebody? What is wrong with treating somebody like just like a slave or just a cog in a machine? What's actually wrong with that. If we live in a purely materialistic universe, if there is no God, then what do we mean when we talk about human rights? Why is it that possessing human DNA magically gives you the set of rights and privileges and value and so forth that we don't give to, ants and aardvarks and lettuces and so on? And the reason, you see, where human rights comes from originally, we've forgotten the story. Human rights is a deeply, deeply Christian idea. It emerged actually in the sort of 16 and 1700s from Christian thinkers wrestling with the question of how do we deal with some of the abuses that are going on in the colonies, particularly the Spanish colonies in South America, where there was lots of mistreatment going on. And people began to ask the question, okay, is this appropriate to treat natives like this? And out of that emerged the idea that actually everybody, European or non-European, are made in the image of God, as Genesis says. They all have value and dignity, and therefore it is inappropriate to treat people this way. And you fast forward through 300 years, and you end up, as that idea is built upon, you end up with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the American Declaration of Independence. All men are born equal. It's a Christian idea. Throw God out makes no sense. So I would say the relevance of Christianity lies in the moment that you look at anything going on in the world and you say there's an injustice. I don't think you can say that without some kind of foundation. And that's before we get to things like all those parts of life that, Zoe and I and you, Janelle, and others would take for granted. The fact we love beauty, the fact we do mathematics, the fact we can think. There's a big philosophical question we haven't got time to get into tonight. Why is it that if we just matter, then we have conscious experiences of the world? That's a huge problem if you throw Christianity out. So Christianity, I would say, and it sounds like Zandra touched on this last time for you, makes sense of everything. One of my favorite quotations from any Christian writer ever is the British Christian writer C.S. Lewis, very famous over here on this side of the Atlantic, also quite well known, I think, in the States. C.S. Lewis once said, I believe in Christianity in the same way as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so I think Christianity is utterly, totally relevant. Sometimes we just, because it's the very air that we breathe and we live in Europe and the States, we just take it for granted. But everything that we hold dear in our culture actually stands on Christian faith and on Jesus.
Well, I listened to, I think it was Jordan Peterson talking about that very topic. And then as you were talking, I thought, were you his guest? But no, you weren't.
No, but there's a couple of books actually that famously did this. There's Tom Holland, who's a British historian, secular historian, wrote an amazing book called Dominion, and that looks at, it's interesting, actually starts with the crucifixion and just how counterintuitive it is that a religion founded on a crucified Messiah could turn the world upside down, because it's a nonsensical idea. But then he looks at all the things that we hold dear in the West actually stand on Christianity, right down to the modern day, where he talks about, stuff that's going on in the, the sort of so-called woke stuff. And I put that in quote marks because I don't think it's a helpful word because it's been weaponized, but all the kind of identity politics today, his last chapter points out that's profoundly Christian, because where do we get the idea that we should care about someone's identity? On atheism, why should you care? If you say, well, my identity is whatever, well, purely on atheism, I might look at you, Janelle, and go, well, I don't care. Why do I care? But it's that Christian idea deep in our culture that says, I do care because you're made in the image of God, which means however much I disagree with you, I should listen to you and take you seriously because you bear the stamp of the Maker.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Zoe?
That was really interesting. I'm glad I'm born in the family I am, but I wish I had some talk about gods and everything and like conversation like that before, so I could I don't know a little bit about this and like have my own IG growing up. But yeah.
Have you managed to find anybody to talk about these kind of things, in your kind of setting in France? Have you tried to find, there's a church or a group of kind of Christians that you might be able to grab it, sit down and drink coffee with and ask questions in person?
Well, there's a church not that far away from my house, but I mean, I love going to church in America, but here it's like only really old people, and it's not that welcoming. Like, it really impressed me to go there.
Whereabouts in France are you, by the way?
I'm like an hour away from Lyon. It's kind of like in the middle of France.
Okay. Well, we can follow this up afterwards through Janelle. But I've got quite a few sort of contacts across France, so it might be worth trying to see. I've got quite a few folks involved in student kind of work all across Europe, so it might be interesting to just see whether there's anybody in your neck of the woods, because it may just be that there is stuff happening and you're not aware of it. It'd be brilliant if we could. Yeah, trust me, there are younger people in France too, and there's also old people like me.
Well, Andy, you have a really interesting book coming out, I think next year. Would you mind sharing a little bit about it?
Yeah, so that's very kind of you. Thank you. And so I have a book coming out with an American publisher. So I mustn't be rude. I mustn't be cheeky about Americans. So the next book's with an American publisher, and it's called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, is the title of the book. And my first two books, popular books, were aimed at people who haven't got a Christian faith. So the atheist book, obviously aimed at my secular friends. The Muslims and Christians book, aimed, well, at least half aimed at Muslims. And this new one is the first one I've written specifically for Christians. And it's really designed, I think, Janelle, to address the fact that so many people in churches, I think, are afraid of talking about what they believe, especially they live in a very secular culture. So, you know, it wouldn't surprise me, Zoe, if you have maybe more people, maybe one or two folks around you in your circle of folks who maybe do have some kind of faith, but they may just be afraid of standing up. It's very hard. That was like me when I was at work. I didn't, you know, my workmates didn't know I was a Christian. Or most of them didn't. So anyway, the book is designed to help with that. So in fact, it starts with that story. The first chapter is called Undercover Christian, and I tell the story of my disastrous time in the workplace, just how awfully bad it was, and then how things changed. And I told the story of a lot of people who influenced me as I looked at how they shared their faith with their friends. And then it teaches some really practical tools, really practical stuff that anybody, whether they've been a Christian for 5 minutes or 55 years, can hopefully use to just have more natural conversations about the things they care about with their friends and their neighbors and their colleagues. So I think just as Christians, we need to get better at conversation.
I love that. In fact, that may be the title of this episode. Talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andy, when is that book releasing, and can people pre-order it on Amazon?
So yes, it's certainly on Amazon. I hate to sort of use the Amazon thing, but it is on Amazon. If you Google it, if you look on Amazon, and it's coming out with Tyndale Publishers, and sometime between Easter and the summer. Apparently, there is a paper shortage worldwide. Who would have thought it? Oh, wow. And so publishing is a bit chaotic right now. So that's why they can't be exactly sure. So I think Amazon have the pre-order date as August. If you order it now, it will be with you by August. But hopefully once it does come out, there'll be a big splash. And if people like my sense of humor, it's sort of lots of bad jokes and funny sort of British stuff.
Go pre-order it. It sounds
pre-order it, and a forward by Lee Strobel. If anyone knows, big American names, Lee has kindly written the forward. So there we are. So
okay, you know what, Lee Strobel, my exchange daughter that Zoe became good friends with, he wrote the book that we watched the movie of. Do you remember watching the movie, Case for Christ? Remember? Did you watch it, Zoe, with us?
I watched the movie at the cinema with you, but I don't know if we're talking about that one.
No, that was Redeeming Love. Okay. But anyway, Leonie told me she would come back on the podcast if I could ever get Lee Strobel on this podcast to talk about faith. Yes, but he's a dream.
Well, you've got an in now. You could at least try and go. You have Bannister on, and I gather you wrote his forward, or he's writing the forward.
There's a connection there. One final question, Andy. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. I just have really appreciated this conversation. This is the final question that I always ask everybody. The Finding Something Real podcast is about a journey towards something real. Real is an acronym for restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. of those 4 gifts that we can find in Jesus Christ, which of course there's many more, but which one stands out to you the most in your life right now and why? Restoration, eternity, authenticity, or love?
Love, definitely. So I would, 2 reasons. One, I mentioned in the context of the book that I wrote, The Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God, and the difference between the God of Islam, God of Christianity. I think the love piece is spectacularly different, and that's always been very important to me. And then I think the other thing as well, I would say, is that I'm struck by the fact that we, whether we're in France or America, wherever we are, most of our cultures are characterized by what a Canadian friend of mine coined this term. He coined the term PBA. They're characterized by PBA. What is PBA? Here you are. So PBA is performance-based acceptance. We live in cultures that say you are accepted if you perform, if you get the right grades at school, if you work hard at work, if you earn enough, hang out with the right people, your social media profile is, sort of active enough or pretty enough or interesting enough. We live in an age that, basically measures people by how they perform. And the problem with that, of course, is all of us mess up at some point. And also that's endlessly tiring. If you think my acceptance is based upon what I do, well, along comes Jesus and cuts across that radically, because at the heart of the message of Jesus stands this radical claim that Jesus makes. It says you are accepted and you are welcomed as you are. Jesus doesn't say, right, before you come to me, get this sorted and do this and do this. Jesus says, come on, as you are, come as you are. And then, he offers to then come alongside and begin dealing with stuff, but that acceptance. And as somebody who is quite driven. I think if I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a nightmare, actually, because I like to work hard and achieve stuff and do things. It's just wonderful to be daily reminded as I dig into the Gospels and encounter Jesus there, what it means to be accepted. So I love that and reminded of that daily. And actually, because I've been made to say cheeky things about Americans, we've just we're late to the party. We've just this month discovered The Chosen, which is an amazing gift the States have given to the world of this wonderful retelling of the story of Jesus. And I think that comes across beautifully. That comes through time and time again, that they were reminded that Jesus was one who held his arms open wide and said, come all who are thirsty, and come and seek and find. So love is the big thing.
I love that. I love that you mentioned The Chosen too, because I know Zoe loved it too. And just really grateful for this conversation. Andy and Zoe, until next time.